All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. So begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank Baruch Hashem, all of our Talmud Torah sponsors, Jerry and Abby Applebaum, for dedicating the Shurim this month in memory of Basia Bas Chaim and David Ben Avram. To thank Doctors Paul and Linda Weinberg for dedicating the Shurim this month in memory of their son, Mordechai Yehoshua Ben Paris Moshe, Velea Miriam Zichron Livracha. Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating the Shurim the Schus of Refuah Shlema for Kathy's sister, Dana Baker Matson, Stephen Terry Zinn, with gratitude to Hashem for their new grandson, Bunim Tzvi Hirsch Zinn, Reb Naftali Tilson, with thanks to his chaver, Benjamin Wall, and wishing the entire Shir Echad Kasher V'Sameach, and Shendin Avram Kelman for dedicating the Shurim in memory of Avram's mother, Sarah Braina Bas Yoshua Heschel. We thank all of our Talmud Torah sponsors for their incredible dedication and generosity. Also, with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Lamed Daled. Yashkar Trab Kaman Akiva for giving the shir yesterday. I know you got to the end of the. We're actually going to start again from the Mishnah. Just this way again to reorient ourselves a little bit, and that way the sugya flows a little bit better. Again, it's Baruch Hashem. As far as the Mishnayos go, one of the more simpler Mishnayos from the previous Mishnayos that we had. So the Mishnah Lamed Gimel Lamed Beis, bottom of 33b, says as follows: Shnaim shekitzu shtei noshim, two men who went ahead and were mekadesh two women. Ubishas knisas l'chuppah. And I will say now again, not brothers, not sisters. Again, this is a case of all unrelated individuals, four unrelated people. Two men married two women. What occurs? Ubishas knisas l'chuppah hichlifu es shel zeh lezeh ve'es shel zeh lezeh. There's a mix-up. It happens, right? There is a mix-up, and halacha l'maisa, again, we get confused. Who is married to who? Now, we'll say, now remember, the part that the Mishnah doesn't indicate is that halacha l'maisa, right? They all had, in other words, each couple had relations. The shaila just is, did they have relations with the people they were actually married to, or chas v'shalom, the people who they were not married to? So we'll say, what's the halacha? Hare'elu chayavan mishum. So remember again, this is piggybacking on the previous sugya. So the previous sugya was talking about a number of things. Number one, isser b'basachos, multiple prohibitions devolving upon the same person at the same time. Isser mosif and isser kolel. Right, Isser Mosif, where again we have a secondary Isser, which includes a larger group of people. Isser Kolel, which involves the same group of people, but piles on additional Isurim on those same individuals. So this Mishnah is continuing in this same topic. So when these two couples engage in relations, right, each couple is having relations with one another, and now again we're unsure, did husband and wife actually cohabit with the correct husband and wife? The result is hare'elu chayavin mishum eshes ish. Ultimately, everyone is chayiv because of adultery. And I will say we're talking about the Mishnah is going to clarify this. You already saw this. I'm not spoiling it for you, right? The Gemara is going to clarify. We're talking about a case of shogeg, a case of accidental avera, not chas v'shalom, a case of intentional violation. So there's Eishes Ish. So the Gemara says, so I look mishum Eishes Ish. Vim hayu achin. If the two men in questions were brothers, mishum Eishes Ach. Then in addition, ultimately to adultery, there would also be the Isra of Eishes Ach, cohabiting with one's brother's wife. Vim hayu achayos. And if the two women were sisters, mishum Isha el Achosa. We have a problem of Achos Isha, wife sister. Vim hayu nidos. And if they were also both nidos, mishum nida, there'd be a problem of nida. So we'll say, so those are all the possible prohibitions that one could potentially violate in a scenario like this. Umafishin osa shlosha chadoshim shema mu'ubarosein. Another halacha that we'll say after the mix-up is discovered. So remember again, we're going to see, because we're talking about a case of accidental avera, so the couples will remain permitted to, right? Husband and wives will remain permitted to one another. The issue, of course, then becomes is in the event that someone is pregnant. In other words, let's say there was a mix-up. We need to know whose child is who. So as a result, once we discover the mix-up, right, and we understand now who is married to who, we make husbands and wives separate from one another for 3 months. In order to determine if they were pregnant or not. But again, if we're talking about a case where the girls were minors, ktanos, and therefore incapable of becoming pregnant, this concern does not exist, and therefore again, everybody's permitted to resume normative married lives. Nifsalu min hatruma. And if they were Kohanos, if they, now both say, again, with Papashtos, we assume that means if they're daughters of Kohanim, they are prohibited from Truma. Rashi says, we'll see what this means exactly in the Gemara. Beautiful. Says the Gemara, Hechlifu. So we'll say, it's interesting, what the Gemara is bothered by over here is the lashon of Shnaim Shekitshu Shtei Nashim Mushas Knisas in the Chuppah, Hechlifu. Hechlifu sounds like a willing exchange. A willing exchange? Midi Bereshi Askinon? Is the Mishnah talking about Rishonim who are knowingly and willingly committing an act of adultery? V'su, Hadatan Rabbi Chia Hare Kan Sheish Esvei Chatos. Furthermore, Rabbi Chia said this Mishnah has a total of 16 potential chatos. Iba mezid miika carbon. But remember again, a carbon chatos is brought for an accidental commission of an avera. Right? There's no carbonos when there is a willful transgression. So if we're talking about mezid, why would we even bring up chatos? On Rabbi Yehuda, Tani huchlefu. You're right. Change the girsa. It's not hechlifu, which means they exchanged, which would sound like a willful commission of an avera. Rather, it's huchlefu. Huchlefu means what? They were swapped, right? They were exchanged. They were exchanged. Ultimately, it means there was a mix-up. There was a mix-up. Shogeg. Hachanai mistabra. Diktani seifim hayu kitano shena ru'iyos leiled machzirno samiyad. The raya to this is, look at the end of the Mishnah. What does the Mishnah say? If the women in question were kitanos, and therefore, again, there's no concern about pregnancy, the halacha is immediately after the mistake is discovered and everything is straightened out. So at that point in time, everyone is returned to their rightful husband and they can resume normative lives. Back at Tanos, where there's no concern about pregnancy, they can resume normal married life immediately. Viba mezid, misharia, but if it's talking about mezid, we'll say again, if a person chas v'shalom intentionally commits adultery, so they become asur lebaal and leboel, halo kashya. So that's not really such a good question because pitui katan ones ninu. Because we'll say, technically speaking, if a man seduced a kitana, even though the kitana quote unquote participated willingly, the seduction of a kitana is still considered to be the halachic equivalent of rape, a violation, because a kitana is considered to be not to have complete das. So the Gemara only be Yisrael mishra shari ela diktani mafrishno so shlosh chadashim shema mu'uberesein halav mu'ubros sharion. So the Gemara says, but nevertheless, leave aside the case of the kitana. You see, even from the other case, we go ahead and we separate the women from their husbands for 3 months to ascertain if they're pregnant, whom they are pregnant from. The inference from that is, if somehow we were to determine, we know for sure that they're not pregnant, they'd be permitted to resume normative married lives immediately. But if at the end of the day this was a willful commission of adultery, would ultimately resumption of normative married lives be permitted? Of course not. Elalav shmamino, hochlefu shmamino. They both say, very important piece of information, very important step in the Gemara. The Gemara says, change the girsa. The girsa is not hechlifu. Hechlifu means, sounds like they willingly engage, these two couples willingly engage in an act of adultery. The Mishnah says, change the girsa from hechlifu to hochlefu. Hochlefu meaning, ultimately, what happened? It was a mix-up. Right? It was a mix-up. There was a mix-up, and as a result, again, it's possible that acts of adultery occurred. Good. For very important piece. We'll say because without that, the rest of the Mishnah does not get started. Good. So now huchlafu. Top of Lamed Daled. Says the Gemara, Uman haytana the isle isser kolal, the isser mosif, the isser basacha. So we'll say this is actually great. So the Gemara says, who is the Tana who holds of all three of these concepts? An Isser Kolel, right? An Isser Mosif and an Isser Bas Achas. Now take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, Uman Haitano, de Masnisin, de Isle Chal al Isser. Now we'll say, the Mishnah is predicated on the principle of Isser Chal al Isser. That literally, again, one layer of prohibition could devolve upon an already existing layer of prohibition. And the Mishnah actually has this in a variety of ways. Look at Rashi. Bein al yedei kolel, bein al yedei mosif, bein al yedei basachas. So if you look at the cases of the Mishnah really utilizes 3 different types of isurim. There's what's called an isser mosif, an isser kolel. So that we've already seen before, right? In yesterday's daf, in Friday's daf, we've seen this concept. An isser mosif, remember again, is a secondary isser which spreads a wider net, includes more people. An isser kolel, no more people, but what? More layers of isser on the same people. Isser bas achos is now when you incur multiple liabilities simultaneously. One act generates simultaneous liability for multiple things. So the Mishnah, by the way, includes all of these elements. Look at Rashi. It's actually a wonderful Rashi. Rashi says, watch this. Here we go. Watch. Rashi, third line down from the top, Lamed Aleph. Listen to this. Follow the progression here. When Reuven is Mekadesh Rachel, right? Reuven is the first guy. Now, I know we've always been using Reuven and Shimon as brothers, right? Right now, we're starting out that they're not brothers. Kishekidesh Reuven. That's the computer. Kishekidesh Reuven es Rachel, right? Tchila. When Reuven went ahead and was Mekadesh Rachel, Ne'esra al Shimon Mishum Eishes Mishum. Eishes Ach ve'Eishes Ah. Rashi's starting right there. They are brothers. Fine. So we've got Reuven and Shimon, right? So Reuven and Shimon are brothers. So when Reuven is Mekadesh Rachel, so Rachel is Asr to Shimon out two things, right? Number one, Eishes Ish, another man's wife. Number two, Eishes Ach, brother's wife. V'hainu Basachas. Now both say those two Isurim occur simultaneously, right? Because the moment that Reuven marries Rachel, those two Isurim, Eishes Ish, Eishes Ach, devolve upon Shimon simultaneously. So that's what we call Basachas. Two Isurim coming at once. The Kamachayiv Leitana Didan Atarvayu. So we'll say, and by the way, our Mishnah holds that clearly you're chayiv for Isurim that occur Basachas. Now what happens? Watch this. This gets very exciting. Chazer Shimon V'kidesh Leah. So we'll say, now what happens? Shimon now is Mekadesh Leah. So Shimon gets married. He marries Leah. Who's Leah? Leah's Rachel's sister. Now, Migo, the Asri Lehanach Kiddushin Bekulu, Shar Achvasa, Mishum Achos Isha, Asri Lehnami Be'eshes Achiv, Mishum Achos Isha. Now, both say, now once Shimon is Mekadesh Leah, so what happens? So now, Rachel becomes Asr to him, how? Right, why? Or why, I should say, Achos Isha, right? So, wife's sister. Now, both say, that is an Isser Mosif. Why? Because now, remember again, when Shimon marries Leah, she becomes Asur to all the other brothers as well. Since she becomes Asur to all the other brothers, a new layer of Isser also devolves upon Shimon. Ultimately, again, now Rachel is also the wife of his sister. Even though Rachel was already Asur to Shimon, right? How was she already Asur to Shimon? Remember again, how was she already Asur to Shimon? Eishes Ish, married woman, and, right? And Eishes Ach, brother's wife, right? Two layers of Isser. Then, when Shimon marries Leah, this is now what we call an Isser Mosif, because now Leah becomes Asur to all of the other brothers, an additional layer of Isser. Once she becomes Asur to all the other brothers, that also adds on another layer of Isser of Shimon vis-a-vis Rachel. Then now Rachel is his wife's sister, three Isurim. V'adayin Rachel zumuteres l'Ruvein baila. Don't say, but listen to this. But Rachel herself is still permitted to Ruvain. What happens? Pirsa Nida. If Rachel now becomes a Nida, Miga di Tosif Israel legabe Baila Mishum Nida, Itosif Badnami Israel legabe Shimon, Haris Esser Mosif. So I'll say, now watch this. Once Rachel becomes a Nida, so once she becomes a Nida, ultimately onto her own husband, Reuven, because of Isser Nida, the Isser Mosif also comes along and says she's now Asura to Shimon, also as a Nida. So we'll say what you see over here, what's happening over here is the case of the Mishnah incorporates all three of these principles. Well, first of all, it incorporates the general principle of Isser Chalal Isser, right? That you could have a concept like this, that one Isser could devolve upon another. We're accepting that already as a given. What the Mishnah also highlights is that you could have Isser Basachas, two Isurim occurring at once, Isser Mosif, right? And Isser Kolel. So Isser Mosif, again, remember, is additional Isser that casts a wider net, more people involved in the Isser. And Isser Kolel, ultimately, same group of people, but more Isurim on them. So who is the Tana who holds of all of these concepts? I'm Rabbi Yudam Rabbi Meir he. It's Rabbi Meir. Both say, listen to this case. Because what does Rabbi Meir say? This Sanya, Yesh ochal achila achas v'chayva la'arba chatos. There is a person who can engage in one act of consumption, and yet one act of consumption could generate an obligation for 4 chatos. But I have to tell you, I don't care how much of a foodie one is, right? There is no amount of food that is worth, no type of food that is worth 4 chatos, right? So I said, there's one act of consumption that could result in 4 chatos. The chayivala arba chatos va'asham echad. Sorry, 4 chatos and 1 asham. I will say, what's the case? Here we go. Tameh, someone who's Tameh, Sha'achal Chelev, who ate Chelev, all right? But not any type of Chelev, V'nosar min amukdashin, and it's nosar from a carbon. So now both sides, he's Tameh, eating sacrificial items. The sacrificial item that he's eating is nosar, right, from karbanos. B'yom Kippurim, and it's Yom Kippur. And it's Yom Kippur, right? The Musar is just stay in shul. Just stay in shul. When you leave shul on Yom Kippur, you get into trouble. So I'll say, so if you look at Rashi, Rashi's Arba Chatos, here they are. Mishum Tuma, Dochal Kachim. So remember again, number one prohibition is a person who's Tameh, eating sacrificial items. Betuma Sagof, Bekares. Umishum Chelev, number two is Chelev. Umishum Nosar, number three is Nosar. Mishum Yom Kippurim, and number four is Yom Kippur. Those are the four Chatos. Where does the asham come from? Va'asham mi'ilos dafilu kohen legabe imurim zarhu. So we'll say number four, the asham is that asham mi'ilos, an asham from going ahead and prohibited benefits from kachim, which is even if you're a kohen, if you eat chelev, which you're not allowed to eat, that's mi'ilah. So the asham is from mi'ilah. So we'll say these are the four chatos and one asham from mi'ilah. Incredible. Rabbi Meir says, by the way, im haisa Shabbos. V'otzia b'fiv chayiv. Rabbi Meir says, if it was Shabbos and you carried out this chelev in your mouth, you'll be chayiv for that as well. Fifth prohibition. Amrulo, they said to Rabbi Meir, no, Amrulo, eino min Hashem. They said to Rabbi Meir, that's not true. Because remember again, Rabbi Meir is throwing in there, what we're looking for is multiple liabilities generated by eating. Rabbi Meir is throwing in something else. That's not generated by eating. That prohibition of Shabbos is a separate prohibition. If you carried something out on Shabbos, you're going to be chayiv, but the simultaneity factor is not there. So they dismiss Rabbi Meir. So both say, so therefore, but the point over here is Rabbi Meir halacha l'maisa says that you're chayiv. He's adding in additional items, but clearly he agrees with the first part. So therefore, it's Rabbi Meir. The sheet of Rabbi Meir is the one who holds that you could be chayiv from multiple liabilities at once. So Rabbi Meir would hold Isser Basachos, Isser Mosif, Isser Kolal. So this is fascinating. Rabbi Meir Ali B'Deman. Now remember, who does Rabbi Meir state this opinion according to? Now I will say, there is another sub-machlokis over here, and this is actually rivetingly fascinating. If you take a look at the last short line in Rashi, Rabbi Meir Ali B'Deman, listen to this. Kilomar, Nihidis Rabbi Meir Iyo Ki Agavna Os Isser Chalal Isser Miu Heichad Dekamis Kavin Ledvar Mitzvah Lisa Isha Keman Mirabosa Sile. So both say, here's what's interesting about the case that we just saw. The guy who's eating chelev, right? The guy who's tamei, who's eating chelev of nosar, of kodshim, on Yom Kippur. So Rabbi Meir said multiple levels of liability and simultaneous liability. Isser Basachos, Isser Mosif, Isser Kolal. I will say, this is a case of Isser. The case of the Mishnah is a little bit different. Remember, what's the case of the Mishnah, Bosai? What's everybody's kavanah in the case? You have two couples. What's their kavanah? What's their kavanah in the Mishnah? To be married, right? Shabbos say this is a case of niskavein lidvar mitzvah. Shabbos say this is different because in the case in the Brayso the Gemara just quoted over here, the intention is to commit an avera, right? Or in other words, even if you want to say the guy is shogeg, right? There's no intention to commit a mitzvah. At most, there's an intention just to eat something. You didn't realize what it is that you were doing. That's different than a case where the kavanah was to commit a mitzvah. In the case over here, is their intention, they got married. Their intention was to consummate the marriage, the Bia Rishona. It's a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah. So we'll say, now watch this. Look at Rashi. Look at Rashi. So he says, Rabbi Meir b'tabed var mitzvah lo asa mitzvah iya lib Rabbi Yeshua on Pater Masechah Shabbos. Well, so listen to this. So here's the shaila. When a person has in mind to do a mitzvah, but instead of doing a mitzvah, they end up doing an aveira. So what's the impact of that act? Now, I will say this is a discussion in Rabbi Elazar Demila Masechah Shabbos. Listen to this. The Sanya Hasam B'Gimara Misha Hayulosh. I'm reading in Rashi. Misha Losh Teitinokos Echelam B'Shabbos Echelam B'Alef B'Shabbos. But say here's the case, right? I have two babies in front of me. One of the babies is supposed to have his bris milah on Shabbos. Remember again, bris is docha Shabbos. One of the babies is a Shabbos bris. One of the babies is a Sunday bris, right? V'shachach, Umal es shal echad b'Shabbos. And I will say, what happens? They all look alike, right? And I was saying, so what happens? So the Moel ends up giving a bris milah to the Sunday baby on Shabbos. And I will say, now let's talk about this just a moment. What's the net effect of that act? The net effect of that act is, remember, what's the status of a milah done before 8 days? Irrelevant. No, not kosher. Not kosher. In fact, if you do a milah before 8 days, there's a din of hatafas dambris. You have to draw blood again on day number 8. So we'll say, halacha l'maisa, a bris done before day 8 is halachically irrelevant. So in this case over here, look what happened. The Moel circumcised Sunday baby on Shabbos. So not only did he not do the mitzvah, I would say, what else did he do? He performed the malacha, right? Which malacha? Shchita. Because any act of drawing blood on Shabbos ultimately, again, is an act of shchita. So I would say this is a case of ta'a bidvar mitzvah v'lo asa mitzvah. In other words, I'm the Moel. My intention was to do a mitzvah. I made a mistake. I didn't end up doing mitzvah. By the way, not only did I not end up doing the mitzvah, but what? I committed an avera. Again, all unintentionally. We're talking about shogeg. So we'll say, so the shaila is in a case like this, ta'a bidvar mitzvah, the lo asa mitzvah, what's the level of liability? So Rashi says, listen to this. So Shadai lo agia, so potra v'shos. So we'll say, this is a machlokes. Ultimately, again, Rabbi Meir, machlokes Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Eliezer. Right? So we're going to say, so Rabbi Yoshua says that you're potter. And ultimately, again, Rabbi Eliezer says that you're chayiv. So Rabbi says, now watch this. We've just established that our Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Meir holds that halacha l'maisa, you could be chayiv for multiple liabilities simultaneously. Isser chalal isser, isser bas achos, isser mosif, isser kolel. Okay, now here's the shayla. But our Mishnah is different. Because right, Rabbi Meir's sheet is quoted in a case of where a person is just committing an isser. Our Mishnah is ta b'dvar mitzvah. Two couples got married. There was a mix-up. They had relations. Ultimately, again, their intention was to do a mitzvah of consummate the marriage. Now they didn't end up doing mitzvah. They didn't avera. The halacha follows Rabbi Meir, or Rabbi Meir is the Tana. But who does Rabbi Meir hold within the discussion of ta b'dvar mitzvah lo asa mitzvah? So let's go back to the Gemara. Rabbi Meir, ali b'diman. With Rabbi Yoshua, if he holds like Rabbi Yoshua, ha'amar ta'abidvar mitzvah pater. So okay, Rabbi Yoshua, right? Because Rabbi Yoshua holds, Rabbi will say that what? Ta'abidvar mitzvah v'lo asa mitzvah is pater from liability. So in that case, I will say, according to Rabbi Yoshua, if the Moel accidentally circumcised Sunday baby on Shabbos, his intention was to perform a mitzvah. And okay, he didn't. He made a mistake. There was a mix-up. But there's no halachic liability in that case. Well, if that's the case, if Rabbi Meir held like Rabbi Yoshua, then Rabbi will say, what should be the din in our Mishnah? Pater. Because this is also a case of ta'a b'dvar mitzvah. Ela ali b'Rabbi Eliezer. It must be that Rabbi Meir holds like Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Eliezer holds ta'a b'dvar mitzvah, v'lo asa mitzvah is what? Chayiv. That's our Mishnah also. To which the Gemara says, well, so therefore again, this is really, let's have to tell you, remember, the beauty of these sugyas, and this is like, I don't mean to say it like this, but like this is like real Gemara, right? Not right. So let's say, so again, what you have over here is something really fascinating. We're learning a lot of like Yisoda. So I've got Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Meir is the opinion who holds that multiple Isurim could pile up one on top of the other, right? Isser Chalal Isser Basachos, simultaneity, Isser Mosif, Isser Kolel. Okay, I know all of that applies in a case where clearly I'm doing something prohibited. What about a case of ta'a b'dvar mitzvah v'lo asa mitzvah? Well, that's a machlokes, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Meir in our Mishnah, this is a case of ta'a b'dvar mitzvah. So who does he hold like? So the simple answer is Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer is going to hold that when the Moel accidentally circumcises a Sunday baby on Shabbos, it's an accident, it's a shogeg, but there's liability. In other words, they both say, just because your intention was to do a mitzvah does not free you from accidental liability. Rabbi Yeshua says, yes, it does. Rabbi Yeshua says intention has a lot to do with everything. Your intention was to do a mitzvah. Your intention was never for something that was prohibited. Your intention was to do something permitted. You ended up doing something prohibited accidentally. But lamaisa, you're exempt. Clearly, Rabbi Meir of our Mishnah holds like Rabbi Eliezer. Maybe that possibility is the Olam Aliv Rabbi Yoshua. No, it could very well be that Rabbi Meir holds like Rabbi Yoshua as well. But how could that be? Rabbi Yoshua frees you from liability, to which the Gemara says, Kikon Rabbi Yoshua b'tar b'dvar mitzvah pater. When does Rabbi Yoshua say, this is fascinating, when does Rabbi Yoshua say that Allah l'maisa, if you make a mistake with a mitzvah, that Allah l'maisa your pater? So watch this. So the Gemara says, Hachinami gabi tinokos dizmano bahol. Oh, maybe the only time Rabbi Yoshua holds that ta'a b'dvar mitzvah pater is in a case like bris milah. Rabbi say, what's unique about bris milah? Zmano bahol. Now, zmano bahol literally means there's a time constraint. There's that. Look at Rashi. Zmano bahol. It's in the intermediate lines of Rashi, about 8 lines down. Zmano bahol shayotarud lamol eshal Shabbos kedei shelo ya'avor zman. So it's very interesting. Maybe the svara of Rabbi Yoshua that ta'a b'dvar mitzvah is pater is why? Because there's a time crunch. So that type of constraint almost sometimes creates a level of urgency which could fuel a little bit of confusion. So therefore, again, it's like halacha protects you if you make a mistake. It's almost as if the halacha is a little bit more understanding of a mistake that's made when you're rushed. And here, you're rushed a little bit. I mean, rushed. You have an entire day, but lamaisa zman ha'banor. It's possible. It's fascinating. When does Rabbi Yoshua say ta'a b'dvar mitzvah pater? It's not in any case. It's only in a case where the mitzvah has a time constraint. I will say, but however, aval hai kevan dizman de'in zman ha'ba'alo. Both say in our Mishnah, is there a time constraint? Is there a time constraint? No. There's no time constraint with marriage, right? They can get married today, get married tomorrow. Even the Bir Rishon can be today, it could be tomorrow. L'maiseh, there's no time constraint. So maybe even Rabbi Yoshua would agree that in our Mishnah, even though it's ta'a b'dvar mitzvah, you would be chayiv. That's the Gemara suggesting. Maybe you would be chayiv as well. So the Gemara says, 1 second. V'harei truma. What about the case of truma? De'in zman ha'bahal. Rabbi say there's no time element. V'yet v'kapater disnan haya ocha b'truma v'no dashu ben grusha ben chalutza. Rabbi say, listen to this case. It's fascinating. A Kohen is eating truma. Right? And what happens? He finds out while he's eating truma that what? That he's the son of a grusha or the son of a chalutza. You know, there's always that guy in the family who decides to do the genealogy tests. You know, hey, let's find out who we're related to. Don't do it, right? Right there. Milton and I were discussing this the other week, right? There's always articles. It's fascinating. There's always articles about this, about people who find out about this, about that. So there's somebody did the genealogy test, and what happens? Kohen's eating his truma, and he finds out that literally, again, his mother was a grusha. She illegally married his father. So now he's not eligible to eat truma. But yet, again, Rabosai, what was his intention when and obviously he's got to stop right now. But what's the shaila? He just ate truma. He's a non-Kohen who ate truma, or a chalal, we'll call it, who ate truma. Not allowed to do that. Now, Rabosai, what was his intention when he started eating the truma? Mitzvah. It's a mitzvah for a Kohen to consume truma. So this is a case of ta'a b'dvar mitzvah, but yet there's no time element associated with it. Rabbi Eliezer mechayiv keren v'chomesh. Rabbi Eliezer says, look, Yechayiv, sorry, right? Sorry about a lot of stuff, right? But Lamaisa now, you're a non-Kohen who ate truma, you have to pay keren and chomesh. You have to pay, again, principal plus a penalty fifth. Rabbi Yeshua poter. Rabbi Yeshua says you're pater. So both say this is clearly a case of ta'a b'dvar mitzvah. Ein zman bahol, there's no time element, and yet Rabbi Yeshua still holds that what? You're pater. So this would seem to indicate that Rabbi Yeshua's pater is nothing to do with time. So the Gemara says, wow. Listen to this. What are we talking about? Talking about a case of chametz dik truma on Erev Pesach, where there is a time element, right? There is a rush. You have to finish it up early. Incredible. So I will say, the other possibility is, so therefore, again, this is where it stops. So therefore, what's interesting about this is as follows. So now what we've established is a couple of things. Number one, right, we switched the gears of the Mishnah from Hechlifu to Hochlefu, Shogeg. Number two, who's the Tana of our Mishnah? Rabbi Meir, because Rabbi Meir is the opinion who holds Isser Chalal Isser, Isser Basachos, Isser Mosif, Isser Kolel. Okay, but our Mishnah is also talking about Ta'a Bidvar Mitzvah. So who does Rabbi Meir hold in Ta'a Bidvar Mitzvah? So the simple answer is, who does he hold like? Rabbi Eliezer. That's the simple answer, because Rabbi Eliezer holds that Ta'a Bidvar Mitzvah is still Chayiv. The Gemara wants to suggest why maybe even he holds like Rabbi Yoshua, because even Rabbi Yoshua, who holds that Ta'a B'dvar Mitzvah is Pater, is only in what kind of case? What kind of case? Zmano Bahul, where there's a time element, right? There's a time crunch. But where there's no time crunch, right? Even Rabbi Yoshua will agree that Ta'a B'dvar Mitzvah is going to be Chayiv. Good. So the Gemara says another possibility by Sema, B'Isr Basachos, V'ali B'd Rabbi Shimon. Perhaps, ultimately, again, we're talking about a situation of Isra Basachas and according to Rabbi Shimon. So I'll say, what does this mean? So Bishlama Kul Husef, I will say, maybe we're setting up differently. Maybe we're ultimately going ahead and saying that Halach Lamaisa, we hold Isra Halal Isra, we also hold Isra Basachas, and the Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Shimon. So Bishlama Kul Hu Mishkachas Lu Dishavinu Shliach, Vishavu Inu Shliach. So therefore I will say, all of the cases, the first three surim in the Mishnah, could be established as well. You could set up a case of Isra Basachos as how? Let's say the man sets up a shaliach, the woman sets up a shaliach, upagu shliach b'shliach. And therefore, again, I will say, halacha l'maisa, the two shluchim, beautiful, right? The two shluchim ultimately go ahead and the two shluchim ultimately accept Kiddushin simultaneously, and therefore all of these isurim ultimately devolve at the same time. Elenidos heichim mishkachosla. I will say, how do you come into the case of nidos? Listen to this. Amarav Amarav bishof os mitoch yud gimel la'achar shlosh esrei lechiyuve inhu. So we'll say the case of nidos that would create simultaneity would be as follows, where the women in the question become ultimately nidos from the time that the men in question, from before they turn 13 until after they turn 13, that would create simultaneous liability for the men. And ultimately, again, mitoch shnei masar le'achar shnei masar lechiyuve inhu. And if the girls became nidos from before they turned 12 and continued bleeding and after the age they came 12. I will say we're not going to get into the technicalities of this. Rashi goes through a whole arichos over here. For our purposes, Rabbi will say the Gemara is just trying to set up the case of simultaneity. What we need to take from this part of the sugya, we'll say, is, number one, like I said before, huchlafu, instead of hichlifu. Number two, first possibility is the Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Meir, who holds Isser Chalal Isser, Isser Basachos, Isser Mosif, Isser Kolal. And who does Rabbi Meir align himself with? Either possibility A is either really comes out as either Rabbi Eliezer, who holds Ta'a B'dvar Mitzvahs Chayiv, or even Rabbi Yoshua, who holds Pater, only holds Pater in the case of Zmano Bahul, but not Zmano Bahul, which Rabbi Pashtas be our Mishnah. Even Rabbi Yoshua would agree there's liability. Second possibility is Rabbi Meir aligns himself ultimately with the position of Rabbi Shimon, who holds Isser Bas Achos, that when you have simultaneity of Isser, multiple Isurim could devolve. And the Gemara then goes on to show how, according to Rabbi Shimon, you could have this simultaneity both in the first three Isurim as well in the case of Nidos. Beautiful. Mafresh no sense. So this is a very interesting sugya now. So remember again, the Mishnah said, okay, after we discover the mix-up, so what's the halacha? Sorry, a second. I had something I wanted to share with you. We'll say, by the way, I just will point out before we go on with this, how do we paskin in the case of simultaneous Isurim? Right? What do we pass in terms of Isser Halal, Isser Kola, Isser Mosif? So we'll say it's actually very important. The Rambam, I love the Rambam. I said, don't you fall in love with the Rambam after a certain amount, right? What would we do without the Rambam? She brings everything together. What incredible. So I'll say, Hilcho Shkagos, Perek Dalit, Halacha Dal. Listen to this. So here the Rambam quotes, Ha'osa Averos Harbe, Behe'elam Achos. If a person commits multiple Averos, I will say, obviously, all of these cases assume that you are violating multiple averos. Helam achos. What does helam achos means? One lapse, right? All of this is happening kind of in one lapse of awareness. So what's the halacha? Rambam says, chayiv chatos al kol achos va'achos. Ultimately, again, one is chayiv for every single prohibition. Now he says v'chein. I'm not going to go. You look. We'll say. By the way, I would urge you look at this Rambam. Hilchos Shkago. Maybe I'll send it out. Dalit Aleph. Dalet Aleph. It's a great halacha that goes through this entire sugya. I want to just show you one line. D'chein, im asa ma'aseh echad, shu chayav alav mishum shemos harbe. If a person goes ahead and engages in one prohibition that has, in one act, I should say, that has with it multiple prohibitions, chayiv al kol shem v'shem, v'hu shahayu ha'isurin kulan ba'in ka'achos, o isser mosif, o isser kolel. So now watch this. The Rambam says, essentially, if you commit one act, and in that one act, there are multiple isurim that come across as a result of that one act, you're going to be chayiv for all of them. As long as what? Either ba'in babasachos, there's simultaneity, or it's an isser mosif, or it's an isser kolel. If what you're doing satisfies any of one of those three criteria, basachos, isser mosif, or isser kolel, there is individual liability for each of the prohibitions. That's how the Rambam paskins. So that's why I will say again, in this case, the best case is the achal chaylev, right? Because that's the best illustration of this. In the achal chaylev case, you're going to be chayiv ultimately again for each of these prohibitions. Why? Basachos. In the case of the Mishnah, you're going to be chayiv. It is basachos, but what else is it? It's an isser mosif, and what? And an isser kolel. So therefore, that's how I pass halacha l'maisa. Number one, isser halal isser. But again, when is isser halal isser? Either A, simultaneity, basachos, isser mosif, wider net, or isser kolel, more isurim stacked on the same people. Incredible. Let's go right there. So we'll say now very interesting halachas. Remember again, what did the Mishnah say? When they discover the mix-up, when the two couples discover the mix-up, and each couple now is, now with its appropriate spouse, right? So what's the halacha? We separate the husbands and wife for 3 months to see, is the woman pregnant from this mix-up. So we separate them for 3 months. We're both saying, by the way, the 3-month concept is the concept of havchana. We have this concept also when a woman becomes widowed, right? That halacha l'maisa, we'll see again about havchana and yibum, but l'maisa again, 3 months they have to separate. The woman, right? Woman is, forget about yibum case. Woman is widowed or woman is divorced. She has to wait 3 months before she gets remarried because we want to see if she's pregnant from her previous husband. So same thing over here. We separate them 3 months. Says the Gemara, Vaha ein isha misaberes bebiya rishona. But a woman doesn't get pregnant from biya rishona. So this is very interesting. Now remember again, the Mishnah is presupposing that halacha l'maisa, we're talking about over here a first marriage, right? So in the case of the Mishnah, we have two couples getting married for the first time, right? And these women are besulos. So what does the Mishnah say? There's a mix-up. So what happens now? Halacha l'maisa. Now again, as a result of the mix-up, these couples had relations with each other, right? Which means these women had relations with men who are not their own husbands. So now we understand the mix-up. Everybody's restored back to their marital unit. We say, okay, wait 3 months before resuming marital intimacy. We want to say if the women are pregnant. Mara says, but a woman doesn't become pregnant from biya rishona. She doesn't become pregnant from the first act of relations. Now, both saying, what does that mean? A woman doesn't become pregnant from the first act of relations. We see this concept in Chazal many times throughout the Gemara. So we'll say, I'll just point out, we don't have time to go too into it now, but Lamaisa, this is a fundamental machlokes about what this concept means. The Nodebi Yehuda says, it doesn't mean that a woman can't become pregnant from Bia Rishona. The Nodebi Yehuda said, just in the eyes of Chazal, most women do not become pregnant from Bia Rishona. Now, why is that? The Nodebi Yehuda doesn't say. But he's saying, Chazal are not saying that women never become pregnant from Bia Rishona, just most times they don't become pregnant from Bia Rishona. It doesn't explain Lamaisa what this is. So we'll say this is the position of the Nodebi Yehuda, the position of the Chasam Sofer. What I will tell you something very interesting. In the Shailas Uchuvas Marsham, Elek Dalid Simin Ayin, he writes something amazing. He says, Rabbosai, this statement of Chazal was reflective of their, we'll call it biological reality. He marks this up to a concept of Nishtanu Hateva. There are concepts, Rabbosai, interesting if there are concepts that Halacha L'Maisa we know were reflective of certain physical realities that were once true, but are different now. Rabbosai, what's the paradigmatic example of that? right? Okay, maybe not. Right? Fish and meat. Right? The Gemara says you're not allowed to eat fish and meat together. Why? Kashla davar acher. Causes saras. Causes illness. I don't know. Does fish and meat today cause illness? I mean, you could say Baruch Hashem because we drink l'chaims in between, nothing ever happened. Let's say again, it's clear today fish and meat don't. But again, it's a halacha in Shulchan Aruch, right? So you cannot eat fish and meat together. That is the halacha, right? But lamaisa, clearly the dangers that Chazal were talking about are not in effect today. Right? Again, there's a whole bunch of literature about this, also about maybe it was mercury levels in fish that apply, whatever it might be. But Lamai says because of nishtanu hateva, that sometimes things change physiologically. So the Marsham suggests over here that this must have been another physiological change. Bismani Gemara clearly Chazal understood women do not become pregnant. They did not become pregnant from Bia Rishona. What was different then than different now? Don't know. But nishtanu hateva. So two approaches. Either the Nod Debiud and the Chassam Sofer, who say that halacha l'maisa, it's really a din ultimately in Rove. Rove, women do not become pregnant from Bia Rishona, or ultimately, again, Marsham, nishtanu hateva. Okay, so says the Gemara, so what are we concerned about? In other words, why are we concerned about the women becoming pregnant? Women do not become, most women, or no women become pregnant from Bia Rishona, to which the Gemara says, Amrav Nachman, Amrav Baravua, Shebalu V'shanu. Okay, the case we'll say is where the couples may have had more than one act of relations. In other words, who says it was just one act of relation? Maybe they had an act of relation and then had another act of relations. Whoa, one second. If there's more than one act of relations, Rabbi, then ultimately, again, there's a whole bunch of liabilities going on over here, right? Forget Rabbi, again, there's liability for every single act of relations. So why are you capping it? Or in other words, why are you capping it at 16 chatos? There could be 32 chatos happening over here. They'll say, by the way, not even that. There's actually the position of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer holds that in the case of forbidden act of relations, there's actually, again, multiple liabilities for the entire act of relations. Rabbi Eliezer holds that Allah Lamaisa, it could be that every motion in the act of relations in and of itself carries with it a different carbonic liability. Ella de bekoach rishon kachashiv, hachenami de bia rishon kachashiv. The Gemara says you're right. Rather, we're just from a liability perspective, we're only focusing on the bia rishona. Amrli Rav Nachman. So Rav said to Rav Nachman, we'll say Amud Beis v'hat tamar bebia rishona yabra. So we'll say this is a fascinating sugya. What do you mean that you can't become pregnant from bia rishona? Tamar became pregnant from Bia Rishon. I will say, remember again, who did Tamar become pregnant from? From Yehuda. So once again, Tamar was married to two men, right, before Yehuda. So watch this. Tamar Bia Rishon Yabra. So I will say, how could Tamar have become pregnant from Bia Rishona? So the Gemara says, so Amrle Tamar be'etzba ma'acha. So I will say, ultimately, so this is fascinating. Apparently, part of the reason why a woman doesn't become pregnant from Bia Rishon, at least in the eyes of Chazal, is because of the Besulim, because of the hymen that's intact by the Bia Rishona. So apparently, it's the presence of the Besulim that ultimately prevent pregnancy from occurring. So Tamar removed her Besulim by herself. She removed her Besulim ultimately in order to become pregnant from Yehuda. So we'll say, this is actually interesting. Whether it's that because of the Basulim, I don't know. I don't know what the physiology of from the eyes of Chazal was it, but Lamaisa, it's the presence of the Basulim in the eyes of Chazal that prevented pregnancy from Bia Rishona. Tamar removed her Basulim before being with Yehuda in order to ensure that she would become at least a heightened probability of becoming pregnant from that act of relations with Yehuda. Turn Rabbi Yitzchak. Kol moachos shall base Rebbe Tamar Shman. So we'll say apparently this was sometimes a practice that women would go ahead and remove their besulim before they would get married, so as to heighten the probability of becoming pregnant from the Bia Rishona. Ultimately, again, the Gemara says, Kol moachos shall base Rebbe. The women in the house of Rebbe would often remove their besulim, before going ahead and getting married, and they were called Tamar. They used to call these girls Tamar. V'lama nikra shman Tamar. Why would they go ahead and be called Tamar? Al shem Tamar shema'acha be'etzba'a. Because of Tamar, who removed her besulim before being with Yehuda in order to heighten the probability of Shabbos. And I'll point out the halacha is actually very much against women removing besulim. But it's actually an interesting shaila in halacha because sometimes you could have a situation where, let's say, a woman goes to the doctor and sometimes the besulim, the membrane itself, could be so thick that it would prevent bia from occurring. So sometimes a woman has to have the besulim surgically opened even before she gets married. Leaving that aside, it's very important that the besulim remain intact because dam besulim, that besulim, again, there's a whole, it's halachically and also hashkafically much associated with that. So lamaisa, halacha contemporarily would frown on this type of practice, but lamaisa, again, it was done. It was done. Of women actively removing the besulim before getting married, lemaisa, in order to go ahead and become pregnant from bia rishona. So the Yevamos say again, where does this practice come from? Apparently Tamar. So Gemara says, but I don't understand. Are you telling me that when Tamar was with Yehuda, she was a besula? She has besulim. She was married to Er and to Onan. She was married twice. So Gemara says, I baha havu Er va'onan. What about Er va'onan? Er va'onan shimshu shelo kedarkon. This is wild. So Er va'onan only had bia shelo kedarka. Did not have regular act of relations with Tamar, only bia shelo kedarka. Incredible. The Gemara says, Meisvei, kol esin va'arba chodesh. So we'll say, let's analyze this. So therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, so Tamar was still a basula. She was still a basula, physiologically a basula, l'maisa, when she was with Yehuda. So we'll say, this is a fascinating halacha. Meisvei, kol esin va'arba chodesh. All 24 months. I will say now which 24 months we're referring to over here. This is a woman had a baby, and she's nursing. So you have to understand something. We live in a different age, right? A different age of synthetic formula. When a mother was nursing, Chazal were very concerned about anything happening to her milk supply. Because if something were to happen to a nursing mother's milk supply, halacha l'maisa, she could put her infant child in danger. So listen to this. So the normal time also to nurse was 24 months. So therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, all 24 months that a woman is nursing, dash mi bifnim, v'zora mi b'chutz, divrei Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi say this is wild. This is Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says when her husband has relations with her, dash mi bifnim means he has relations with her, but ejaculation should happen outside. He should not ejaculate inside of her, out of concern of what? Impregnating her. Now I both say, this is absolutely wild. Why is this absolutely wild? Because I will say, we have a very severe avera called hotzah zar levatala, of wasting of seed. It's one of these difficult, it's uncomfortable to speak about, because it's an avera that many are nechshalin, right, during our youth and different things like that. But lamaisa, try to be mitaki. And I will say, it's an amazing thing. If you look in the tefillah of tshuva of Rabbeinu Yonah that we say before Yom Kippur, it's an amazing thing. We say before Yom Kippur, we say this tshuva of Rabbeinu Yonah. And I will say, do you know the avera that's referenced to most in that tshuva, in that piece, the avera most, is hotzah zar levatala, is wasting of seed. And it's an incredible thing because you think it's like Yom Kippur, it's Rabbeinu Yonah, we're people. And again, in our youth and growing up, and even not in our youth, like we all have different yitzhak. We're human beings. Like we saw at Tzaddik, right? The most common Yetzirah. We saw in the Gemara, right, that there are two averas that no one is saved from. What are the two averas? Right? Immorality and theft. Everybody violates that in different ways. We're human beings. And as severe as hotzah zar levatala, the wasting of seed is, most of us are nichshal in it at different times in life. Rabbeinu Yonah puts that front and center, right? So if we're going to do tshuva, let's be honest. If we're going to do tshuva, let's have a conversation. If we're going to do tshuva, let's put our cards on the table, because that's the only way to rectify things. So this seems like totally wild. So Rabbi Eliezer says, however, halacha l'maisa, when a woman is pregnant, when a woman is nursing, we don't want her to become pregnant, so the husband can have relations with her, but he ejaculates outside. So we'll say, so I'll just point out, how could Rabbi Eliezer allow that? How could he allow that? Isn't that wasting of seed? So we'll say, I will tell you something amazing. You should know, where does this shaila come up all the time? Not all the time, right? Where does this shaila come up? I will say, in situations of infertility, right? Often when a couple is struggling with infertility, so often, for two reasons. Number one, often they have to do a semen sample. And so the way they used to do it, was vaginal retrieval. A couple would go ahead and have relations, and they would retrieve the zera after relations. Today, often they don't like to do it that way because they like to have what's called a clean sample, right? Without anything else mixed into it. So Lamaisa, they asked the husband for a sample. How do you provide a sample, right? How do you provide a sample? So there's a whole discussion in the poskim about whether or not one is permitted to provide a semen sample. Now, there's two different reasons why they'd want a semen sample. One is just for semen analysis, to see what's the sperm count was, right? Is the infertility is an issue with the husband, issue with the wife, a combination. So often they need a sample. Other times they need a sample ultimately to fertilize the eggs. So we'll say there's a lot of discussion in the poskim about going ahead and providing a sample. So there's a whole discussion that says that's not called Hotza'as Zera Levatala. Because we'll say, what's the definition of Levatala? What does Levatala mean? To waste for no purpose. This is not a waste. This is not a waste. The zera is actively being used. So because the zera is being used, that's a purposeful emission, right? That is a purposeful zera. So halacha l'maisa, again, there are many poskim who are against it, but many poskim ultimately who permit it for this particular reason. It would seem to be that Rabbi Eliezer is using the same logic. That Rabbi Eliezer will say it's a mitzvah to be with one's wife. It's a mitzvah to have a normal marital intimacy. So but yet, in this case, Rabbi Eliezer says she cannot become pregnant, because allowing her to become pregnant could potentially put the nursing baby in mortal danger. So therefore, again, in this case, being motzi zera outside of the wife is not called levatala. That's not called levatala. In other words, levatala means when there's no active purpose which is being served. But when there is a purpose, ultimately, again, it's not called levatala. But say now, obviously, these types of shilas, and we know passing this way, by the way, with Rabbi Eliezer, right? But the Maisa, again, when it comes to the infertility shilas, again, these are important shilas. Devarim ha'omdo barumo shel olam that have to be done in consultation with someone who knows these halachas. Because Rabbi say doing it the wrong way, halacha l'maisa is a severe iser kares, right? It's a severe thing that we try to avoid when possible. But l'maisa, again, just understand that's what's driving Rabbi Eliezer. This is not called levatala because l'maisa, this is how one engages in a normative act of relations with one's wife during the time that she is nursing. Amalei, halalu eina ela kamai se'er va'onan. Other opinions said, what are you talking about? Said Rabbi Eliezer, what are you talking about? Having relations and then wasting seed on the outside, that's like er va'onan. That's like er va'onan. So the Gemara says, now what does that tell you? That sounds, the fact that it compares having relations and then ejaculating outside to er va'onan sounds like what? Erva Onan did have normal relations with Tamar. Just what didn't they do? They weren't motzi zera inside of her. They were motzi zera outside of her. But it sounds they had normative active relations. To which the Gemara says, Kemaise Erva Onan, velo Kemaise Erva Onan. It's like the act of Erva Onan, but not like the act of Erva Onan. How so? Kemaise Erva Onan dechsev v'haya im ba'el eshesachiv v'shiches arza, velo Kemaise Erva Onan. We'll say here's the difference. The Gemara says Erva Onan, it's like their act because Erva Onan did not emit zera in a way that was capable of impregnating Tamar. But it was not Erva Onan, and that Erva Onan only had Bia Shalo Kedarka with Tamar and never had Bia Kedarka. That's why, even though Tamar was married twice, halacha l'maisa, she was still a besula when it came to Yehuda, which is why she actively removed her besulim in order to become pregnant from Yehuda. So the Gemara says, Bishlama Onan dichsiv be shiches arza. So by Onan it says, shiches arza. Onan it says, he spilled his seed on the ground. That's, by the way, right? The English word for wasting seed, the English term is onanism, right? It's borrowed from Onan, right? Onanism, right? Comes from this. Torah says, Oned shiches arza, he wasted his zera on the ground. So I understand by Onan, Ella Erminal. How do we know the Er did it? Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak desiv Yevamos gam oso. The pasuk says Hashem also killed him. Afhu ba'osa misames. So we'll say the Torah is equating the behaviors of Er and Onan together. Bishlama Onan. So we'll say, why do they do this? Why do they do this? Bishlama Onan mishum lo yahazara. So we'll say it's actually interesting. Remember again, Onan marries Tamar. Why? As a form of yibum, right? Er dies without children. Onan marries him, or Onan marries Tamar. Why does Onan waste his seed and not impregnate Tamar? Suppose it's incredible. Onan did not want to give offspring to his brother, right? He was uninterested in lo yihazara. Ultimately, again, the zera is not going to be his. Ella my time avatachi. Why didn't want to make Tamar pregnant? Kadesh lo tisaber v'yachish yafya. Tamar apparently was very beautiful, and was concerned that if Tamar would become pregnant, she would lose her beauty. He wanted his wife to remain beautiful. He did not want her to become ruined, quote unquote, by pregnancy. Okay. So again, just point how exactly did we get into this? Right, so again, right, we really took like a sharp detour. Right, so again, just to point out, just let's loop this back a little bit. Right, so just understand the way we got here was because the Mishnah said that after we discover the mix-up and everyone is returned back to their rightful spouse, they have to separate for 3 months in the event that anyone's pregnant to know whom they're pregnant from. To which the Gemara says, but 1 second, you don't become pregnant from Bia Rishona. So the Gemara says either one of 2 possibilities. Either we're talking about, you're right, this maybe there were multiple acts of Bia. That's possibility number 1. Possibility number 2 is that maybe the woman in question took out her Besulim. And if you take out your Besulim, ultimately you can become pregnant from Bia Rishona. Who shows us that you can become pregnant from Bia Rishona if you take out the Besulim? Who's the example of that? Tamar. And then we just said, Tamar, Besula, she's married twice. Then we get into that whole discussion. Rabbi, again, just remember the concept that a woman can't become pregnant from Bia Rishona. Machlokes, no debi de chasam sofer on one side versus the marsham. Is it nishtana hateva? Is it rov? Good. A little bit weiter. We have a few minutes left. So we'll say, let's go. Tan Rabbanan. Osa, so we'll say this is fascinating. When a man and wife, when a husband and wife or a man and woman have relations, so the halacha is after the act of relations, everybody's chayiv to go to the mikvah. So the pasuk the talking over here of the isha asher yishkav ish osa shechva zera v'rachatzu b'mayim v'tamu ada erev. So we'll say so the halacha is that whenever you come in contact with zera, so the man emits zera, the woman has the zera inside of her. So halacha l'maisa, that requires immersion in a mikvah when there's contact with zera. So the Gemara says, prat lekala. Who does this come to exclude? A bride. That a bride doesn't have this chiyuv in tvila. Rashi says over here, osa v'isha yishkav ish osa shech v'azev rachzo ma'im osa miutus. Fine. Osa prat lekala comes to exclude a kala. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Chum say prat l'shelo kedarko. It comes to exclude bia shelo kedarko. It's only a regular bia that ultimately generates a mikvah obligation. Bia shelo kedarko doesn't generate a mikvah obligation. Amrle hon breed Rav Nachman. Lemek hasar Rabbi Yehuda. So we'll say, why does Rabbi Yehuda say it excludes a kala? Why would it exclude a kala? Hatorah chasa al tachshite kala. So we'll say this is incredible. Why don't we require immersion in a mikvah for a kala? Because a kala spent so much time on her makeup, on her adornments. If you make her go to the mikvah, what happens? It all washes off. Incredible. I will say, take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, Prat lekala, de lo baya tvila mishum tuma bia rishona. Why is that? Aktakshite kala, kachal usrak, shenosenes alpana. She has all of this beautiful makeup. Vim titbol ya'avirum hamayim. And if she goes to the mikvah, the water removes all of that. So I'll, cover to the kala, we don't make her go to the mikvah. So the Gemara says, Amar le lefishin isha. Furthermore, Rabbi Duchasa al tachshite kala. Amar le lefishin isha misaberes maybe a rishona. There's another reason. Ultimately, again, because a woman does not become pregnant from bia rishona. The Rabbi will say, now what does it have to do with anything? So this is actually very interesting. The Rashi points out over the fishin. We'll end with this. The fishin isha misaberes bia rishona. V'lo shichva zera karinabe. So Rabbi will say the term shichvas zera, right, which we normally translate as a semen, but ultimately means zera that has the ability to impregnate. So because ultimately, again, a woman doesn't have the ability to become tamea, to become pregnant from bia rishona, therefore halacha lemaisa, that zera doesn't have this halachic designation of shichvas zera. And the only time that there is a tvila obligation generated from bia is when the zera has the ability to go ahead and impregnate. So we'll stop over here. We'll pick up in Mir Hashem with this machlokes tomorrow. Shkoyach. Excellent. 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 All right, Chevron, everyone have a wonderful day.